Recording started.
All right, everybody. Welcome to this week's Matrix discussion group call for tactical sovereignty. This is January 16th, 2022. And this should be an interesting year, I think. It might even be a little more interesting than the past year. I would hope it doesn't get too much more interesting, but whatever will come will come. And one of the things I wanted to touch on a little bit here this evening is looking at the past basically to comprehend the future, to know what's going to happen. I was in the company of 4 or 5 gentlemen a few days ago, and they were talking about economic things, what things are like down here on Florida, and specifically regarding real estate, because things are selling for crazy prices right now. In fact, there's almost bidding wars, and people are purchasing things for even over the value, the stated value, just to grab stuff up. And somebody was asking, how long they thought this would continue, if it was going to implode at some point and when. And one of the gentlemen replied and said, of course it's going to implode. It can't go on forever. And a couple of the other people made remarks to the effect that they didn't really think that they should take advice from, talking heads on TV or things like that. Um, they really thought, you should pay attention to more learned people. And one of the guys asked the gentleman who had spoke up regarding it imploding, said, well, what's your history? And the guy said, well, he says, I'm an analyst, I'm an investor. And he said, well, in what field? And he said, well, real estate. That's why I was speaking up regarding it. And I don't think you just have to be necessarily like an insider with inside info to know what's happening. If you look back in time, you can easily see what's going to happen to the future. I remember here about a year and a half or two ago, back, well, it was actually the fall of 2019. I was researching the effects of an economic contraction and what really happens to a country when that occurs and what happens to markets when that occur. And when I was looking that up, I thought it was very interesting that I was also finding listings of when different contractions had happened in the USA. And it had always been pretty much on a 10-year cycle, about every 10 years, which is exactly the way this financial system is set up. It's set up to expand and contract, expand and contract. That's just the way an inflationary system works. And basically giving out and then pulling it back in, and then, to put it into maybe practical terms, um, everybody buying up a bunch of stuff and then going and taking it back and reselling it again. This is kind of the idea. And I had said back in the fall of 2019 that 2020 was going to look very interesting because we were going to have some serious economic things coming up from just watching the markets with the banks and with what they were doing with the repo loans. And the repo loans basically stands for repurchase loans because the banks have to settle out at zero at the end of every business day. And so therefore, they would loan or borrow money to each other, basically in overnight loans. And then the next day they'd trade it back. And they would do this just as a nicety, basically, to keep the system functioning correctly. And they would do them at either zero or very near zero interest rates. And the banks, starting in the early fall of 2019, were starting to have less trust in the system, in the financial sector. And so they actually turned to the Fed, they turned to the Treasury and said, hey, we're not able really to borrow money and loan money back and forth with each other anymore. If we do, it's being done at 10 or 15% interest rates, which is ridiculous. There's no way they could go on paying those rates. And so they told the Fed, hey, unless we get the money from you, there's going to be serious issues. And so they started getting the money from the Fed. That was supposed to end, I believe, October 15th of 2019, if I recall correctly. Well, we know how it all is. When you're giving handouts to somebody, they never go away. They keep coming back wanting more, and that's what's continued. And the last time I checked was probably well over a year ago, and at that time, there had been $7 to $8 trillion in repo loans given out by the Fed to these banks. And when you look back in history and look what happened when the big banks were bailed out with TARP, if anybody remembers TARP, a lot of people threw their hands up and they're like, what's going on? What are we doing, giving money to the banks? And at that time, the money that had been given to the banks, I believe, was somewhere between 600 to $800 million. All right. And that pales in comparison hugely to these repo loans that have been floating back and forth now for, well, now we're going well over year and a half, 2 years, not going on 2 years of doing this. And this is ridiculous. And so you had to realize that something was coming financially because when TARP occurred, TARP happened in the fall, and it was like 3 months later, bang, we had the huge housing bubble burst. Happened immediately after that. And so when I was looking at that and what had happened with TARP, I knew it only made sense that these repo loans were going to trigger something as well. Only it was going to trigger something a whole lot bigger than what was caused by just the housing bubble bursting and people losing their homes. And now what we've seen is something not being talked about. Yeah, people are losing their homes. There was a moratorium put on evictions of people and foreclosures, but that moratorium had an end date. And at that end date, over the past few months, where you weren't required to pay, whether it was rent or the mortgage, you were required to pay back in full that amount that you hadn't been paying. And so it was only natural that we're going to be seeing major bankruptcies. And I had a friend of mine today, and they were on their computer and they're like, oh my gosh, Brian, have you looked at bankruptcies? And I'm like, no. I said, I don't have to. I know what's happening. I know what's going on now and is going to be increasing in the future because people were not going to be able to pay back that money. And at the same time, we don't just see problems with housing and maybe evictions or foreclosures, but a lot of stores have closed up. Businesses that, were mom and pop businesses that existed for a long time and employed people in the community are shutting down. And everything is becoming more and more centralized. And I remember about 6 or 8 months ago, I was listening to a meeting from, it wasn't the World Economic Forum. It was one of those organizations. Anyway, they were saying that with this great reset, what was going to happen, this revolutionary reset that was occurring, wasn't going to be like revolutions of the past. So revolutions of the past were basically power struggles. Who was taking power from who? That's what revolutions were really always all about. They said this time, this revolution was going to be about a centralization of power. And I think that's exactly what we've seen. And this is something that is not new. It's been played out in history many, many times. If you look at their playbook of things that they do, they've got 5 essential elements that they would do whenever going in and trying to usurp the power of a nation. The first thing they would do would be to find who the opposition was. within that system, within that country or that nation. Find that opposition and fund them. No matter whether they believed with the ideology or not of those organizations, they were just funding them to help them bring down any kind of stability that there was within that nation. Of course, the second thing, one of the things they would always do, we know about assassination, which is pretty obvious. We've seen a lot of that happening, especially in the last year, South America specifically. The third way they would try to influence things would be economic influence. And that's done through the tariffs, which is goods and services being exchanged between the countries, or even outright, you know, ghosting a country. You can call it that, and putting embargoes on them and not letting anybody buy or sell with them. Right? That causes huge economic problems for a nation. Although you need to understand that's not going to cause problems for people at the top. The problems that the people at the top experience come from underneath, from those people who are influenced by, that economic warfare. And the fourth method that would be used, which is, I think, probably pretty in the face of everybody today, would be through media takeover. This started in the USA 100 years ago, especially in the newspaper industry, with the taking over of newspapers and consolidating the amount of people that really had control over those newspapers. One of the ideas really behind the media takeover of today, because not too many people really read the paper, they get everything off from their talking heads on TV, that, it's a lot cheaper for them to go and purchase a talking head than it is to purchase a newspaper. In which, I mean, that just makes a whole lot more sense. It's easier to buy a reporter than it is to buy a paper. And the fifth thing that would be used would be to create chaos. I believe that's even on the dollar bill, order out of chaos. That's a motto that they've followed. That's a plan that they've followed all through time. And we've seen a lot of the chaos being manufactured, especially recently. But even if we go back into, somewhat recent events, go back 50 years ago, you remember the flower power movement. Well, that was a form of chaos. Today we see it in the form of maybe the Proud Boys or the BLM. I thought BLM actually was very interesting because to me it was a word that sounded really familiar. Just when you look at the acronym BLM. And it hit me when I was looking through one of my history books. And it hit me when I noticed the era prior to the Civil War, which was referred to as the Anti-Bellum Period. Bellum sounded a lot like BLM to me. And the Anti-Bellum was a time of no wars, but Bellum really refers to spiritual warfare. And we're seeing that very much today. And I think if we look at those things that were done, whether it's funding the opposition, assassination, economic media takeover, creation of chaos, and look at things that have happened in different nations over the years, and you can go to Iran in the early 50s. And, that was a political strategy that was used there. Guatemala in 1954, they used the economic form of it to try and undermine the Guatemalan government, especially through United Fruit Company, which I believe was a U.S. held company. We saw it in Congo in the 1960s, early 1960s. That was psychological. Dominican Republic saw it at the same time. That was political. And of course, from the 60s to around 1970, we saw it in Vietnam, Brazil, Chile, and those were all military means that they used with those. These were just all forms of their ideological subversion. And, subversion is basically just undermining a nation or undermining a people. It's really about getting a hold of the minds of men and controlling the way people think, controlling the way people react to different things. Because if they can control how somebody's going to react to a situation, then they know what kind of situation to place in front of them. Specifically, if they want a particular reaction, that's exactly what they do, because they've got their think tanks and they know that different things cause different reactions. And so whenever they're looking for a specific reaction, and they just go to their playbook and they're like, okay, what causes people to react this way? Good. That's what we'll put in front of them. But I think today, this centralization that they've talked about was really, I see it as being taken by maybe the medical field and being used that way, scaring people through purposes of their health, because that's something that is specific to every man and woman. Health matters to everyone. That is one thing across the board that can be used and always get a good gain of function out of it, if you want to put it that way. But I think what needs to be looked at the most and be paid attention to the most is the system that's being used to do these things. It isn't really your typical governmental system. It's a system of management. And you stop and think about management within a company, and management within a company, they take their orders from the top. And at the top of a company, what's always the ultimate goal? They have two ultimate goals. It's always one, to make money, and number two, to get bigger. And they use their managers, the underlying people, to do things for them. And these managers are all very compartmentalized. They all have their specific duties. And one of the things that happens if you see a managerial situation like this occur at large levels, at big scales, there's always one end result. It ends up imploding on itself and it doesn't succeed. And I think that's something everybody would root for. Although we have to remember that there's a fear there that we really need to pay attention to. It's a real fear, not a manufactured fear like they're producing today or like they've produced over time in history. The real fear is that when something does collapse, when something does end, it also means it's the birth of a new beginning for something else. And so the question would be, were this to collapse, or should I say, when it collapses, what is it that's going to be taking over? That's where the real, I'll call it concern instead of fear. That's where our real concern should be. That's really what we should be paying attention to, is what could be possibly waiting in the wings to pick up things when they fall apart. Unfortunately, it seems like with people, if you look at common people today, when a man or woman loses their job, one of their first questions is to a friend or to a family member, um, do you know where the unemployment office is located? Or do you know how to access unemployment online? And that's people's, normally it's their first go-to. It hasn't been for mine. It never was. My go-to, if, something in job ended or something like that, my first go-to was, okay, where do I go now? And at the same time, people should have that planned in the back of their mind. If I was going to quit being involved in the line of business I'm doing right now, what would I do? And maybe even put some things in place to do that. If you could put something in place so that you're doing it for yourself, that would be the ultimate goal. And if a system was to collapse, that should also be the ultimate goal of people. is to be able to say, okay, how am I taking care of this myself? How are we handling this as a people? And not just wait for the next shiny object or the next system to come along um, with a totalitarian hand and say they're going to take over. We're going to take care of everything for you guys. You have nothing to worry about, because we really know that whenever you're told you have nothing to worry about, um, surely there is definite destruction on the horizon. And that was just my thoughts on what's happening, especially, looking at the thermometer, of what's happened over time, because you're going to know what's going to happen in the future just by looking at the past, because everything just replays itself. Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And I would definitely agree with that. A lot of people are looking for certain exact things to happen. And if those certain exact things don't happen, then okay, then it must not be what I think the new world order is. And I think it has to be a certain exact physical, specifically, things to occur that they have been told or envisioned in their mind, when that's not really the way it works. But the results really will rhyme with what they have physically envisioned. And so that's really what needs to be looked at and paid attention to. The way this system has operated, the way the New World Order has operated since the 1780s, because they saw prior to that the system that they currently had didn't work. It was not feasible for somebody to be king. It was not a good business choice, uh, especially if you're born into one of those families, because when you became king, you may have, and many of them did, the option of killing off the rest of the males that might be your successor, or a cousin that you think might have aspirations to take your seat, or getting rid of military people, because very often it would be somebody from the military that would rise up and take over the position. So they decided to do it in a little bit cleaner manner with the USA. And yeah, you might still be choosing from within the family, whether you know it or not. Um, but they wouldn't necessarily have to worry about somebody jumping on the stage and stabbing them, or worry about somebody necessarily poisoning them. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened. It doesn't mean that there hasn't been some rides in convertibles that didn't turn out too well. That things will occur, especially if those people don't do what the powers that be put them in place have told them to do or have authorized them to do. If they operate outside their boundaries, then their future really doesn't look that bright. But as a whole, it's gone along very well in the USA for the powers that shouldn't be. And they've brought in their own people. And sometimes some of their family members were military men that came in, such as Eisenhower. And so their new way of system of managing things has worked very well. But like I said, using the managerial system to control a people will always implode on itself. There's no other way for it to not end up imploding on itself, because it's going to get out of hand, and there's no way to keep it from getting out of hand. It will. And I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Keith, or anybody. Feel free to speak up. Anybody had any topics they wanted to mention in tonight's group podcast? Feel free, guys.
Well, yeah, I'd like to speak on it. Um, you mentioned the thing about the press in regards to newspaper and in relation to electronic form, video, audio, newscasts, things like that. And I think one of the main elements is people need to realize this supposed new world order is already established when Roman Empire made its contract with the Vatican to establish postal roads for management purposes of their documentation to assert that new Catholicism amongst the Roman people. And they used that as a way of spreading news known as letters closed, and then produced letters open, which is your news articles to the general public, letting them know this is the new rules and regulations and stuff set out by the Roman emperor. Today, we have a system known as statistics where people voluntarily sign up for that Roman Empire. People believe the statistics that the news reporters put out and believe they're part of that statistical system. And it's only because they stood up and volunteered because they believed in the education system that taught them to do so. Remember this, remember this, remember this, remember this. Now, you were established and assigned as a corporate, not you, but there was a corporate establishment which a number was assigned to a newborn child upon birth registration, which is an agreement with the Social Security Administration to assist us in assigning that number. And that comes from the Department of Defense. If we look at 1903, I think it was, I'm not, maybe 1920, 1902. My mind hasn't gotten the numbers correct, but we remember it through the Dick Act, otherwise known as the Militia Act. You're either part of their war by entering yourself into those statistics, or you quit being a dick and go back to your father as a prodigal son and spread that word. That's my viewpoint.
You know, it's interesting. You're bringing up education there, Keith, and I'm not sure how many people really realize where our educational system came from, but it originated in the late 19th century, and it was brought in out of Prussia. It was found in the Prussian Empire.
French
And
Indian War Military School.
yeah, and how many people remember what Prussia is today? Prussia today is Germany.
Yeah, they just recently filed an international claim, I believe.
And well, it's interesting too. You know, what family came out of Germany? Isn't that the same family that is sitting on the throne of England today?
That's also the language that the Bible was written in before King James converted it.
Yep. I find it interesting how many things have come out of the German area of the world that have kind of spread everywhere. It seems like a lot of people's eyes, you know, point in one direction, point in another direction, whether it's City of London or Vatican, different things like that and stuff. But you know, when you really look at the region around Germany, it's like, huh, it seems like so many things really lead back to that.
Yep, exactly. I think that's one of the reasons that Hitler was fighting so hard to prove that the Germans were the superior race. But I think that's a confusing concept too.
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
I did have something to talk about to kind of tie together what you were saying. So when you were talking about, you had the monarchy system and how if you had a king, they were afraid that their brother or their cousin and they would kill them off. That still exists to me. It still exists today. You did mention part of it because the powers that be they place their people in different locations. You look at Haiti, and you look at Iraq, as you stated before. If they don't do what they are instructed to do, then they're taken out. But the one thing that I wanted to mention is how the media is closely tied to that. Just imagine if, the people understood and knew the history of how the monarch was, and they would kill people off. Even in the Bible, they talk, where they talk about killing the firstborns. But you have to use the media to do that, because if they don't use the media to divert the mind of the people, then people are going to question everything that goes on with the system itself. Now, is that a correct thinking in saying that?
No, I would totally agree with you. It still goes on. It goes on a larger basis today than it used to.
Right.
But if you go back to times of, say, even like the Holy Roman Empire, for instance, and that they had, for instance, there was a year that was called the Year of Five Kings, or the Year of Five Emperors, because five different guys came and went through there. Some were family, some were military. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't leave office with a golden parachute retirement. You left office with a either a poisoned body or a slit neck or chopped off head. One of the three.
That's true. And so with that being said, exactly what you said, with that being said, I'm not sure what it was like back then because I wasn't there, but I know what it's like now. And I know that people are very curious, right? So if you have those type of things that's going on in place without having the media control the narrative of what's going on, then people are going to question that. And they're going to be like, well, I don't trust this king. I don't trust this president. I don't trust anything. But you have to have that media that's going to be tied to it, that's going to be controlled by the powers that be, to create that narrative to keep people in line, right?
Right. It's a common theme because that box is in everybody's home.
Well, and not only that, but the problem is that when we seek a news source, we then don't believe in it, and we lose our faith in it. What happens is we just go seek another news faith. This is one of those things I come to realize in the 12-step program. Everybody's trying to tell me you got to get a sponsor. You got to get a sponsor. Well, what if I change that sponsor? Well, then you just get another sponsor. I said, well, what if I keep one sponsor in my heart? Oh, who's that? Oh, our Father, which aren't we told that we're supposed to be spiritual in this? Isn't that why we follow? So we correlate all of the daily readings with the biblical scriptures. Isn't that where we say we get our 12 steps from, is from the biblical scriptures? So why aren't we paying recognition to that as our counsel? Immutable.
Yeah, I agree. That inspires something, though, that is, unfortunately, I think, very dangerous to a lot of people. Something that people are probably scared of more than anything. And I think it's because of outside sources that have taught them to be scared of it. But it is being alone in your own mind, not having all these outside interferences, and being able to sit and not necessarily sit and meditate and blank your mind out. To me, forms of that can be kind of dangerous, because if you're blanking your mind out and blanking your soul out, you could also be opening the door for other entities to inhabit. But I mean, really sit by themselves for several hours and ponder things. I think people are scared the most of being left alone with their own mind.
I totally agree with you on that one. I do. Go ahead, Keith. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can't possibly be alone. I'm one of those people. I get in my own mind, and I end up with a convention with all my different personalities. I just have them multiple personalities, but I've got them in order, and no one can prove otherwise.
Yeah, I do meditate. So you're absolutely correct that people, not everybody, but I mean, it's just there's nothing like sitting and wondering and pondering, because when you do that, it takes you to different places, and it makes you think, and it takes you away from the media, and it takes you away from all of these things that's a distraction that keep you locked in. That's pretty much why I was saying what I said to you about the the media and the monarch as well, because if people actually took the time to step away from that and see within themselves, one, that little inner voice is that tells you to turn left instead of right, and you go right anyway, and you crash your car or something like that, you'll listen to it more, and then you'll become more intuitive to what's going on in your surroundings and in the world.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things like that that people need to be able to learn to pay attention to, and it does come with spending that alone time, with being in touch with that, spirit within yourself, or whether it's the voice of a multitude of your hidden friends, like Keith said. But if you don't spend that time, if you don't invest that and exercise that, then you're not going to know that voice when it speaks to you. And that's the important part. And I think that's one of the things that they're trying to manage out of existence today, is that we know better for you, and what we're going to show you, what you need to do, and what pill to take, what jabby to get, or whatever the case may be. And they're going to be your mind, and you're not going to have to. There was, and let me get this right. Let me take a look. I think I wrote him down somewhere. But there is a university professor. His name is Yuval Harari. And Yuval Harari, and I'll tell you where he's the university professor at in a minute, and that's going to shock you even more. But this professor, I was listening to a speech by him, and he was talking about technology and the direction of mankind and the direction that they're planning on moving people in. Keep in mind that name Yuval, he's a Hebrew gentleman, all right? And he said that eventually what is happening is that the plan is, and he wasn't saying this from the outside, he was saying this as an insider, okay? He was one of them trying to make this occur. That the plan was that eventually the human mind was going to be hackable, so that all of those maybe private thoughts and things like that you think that you have, the side of you that you hold on to and don't necessarily expose to every single man or woman that you meet, that stuff was no longer going to become private.
Yeah,
All of that eventually was going to be hackable, and they were going to be able to get all that data on you.
Yep. Tom Cruise, pre-crime.
Yeah, and you think about thought crimes and stuff like that. But I mean, this is even a step beyond thought crime, because this crime, or this, yeah, it is a crime, but this direction that they want to move in is just to be able to simply tap into your head. Now, whether they do that while you're playing a computer game or something like that online, they've experimented with that. The military has experimented with that in the past, going back even into the 80s. There was different video games that they came out with that a lot of people had some very sinister experiences with. I'll just put it that way. And so, yeah, and the military has admitted that they've experimented in these areas. And so, if they're have experimented in those areas, they're doing it because it's a direction they plan on moving in. And this is what this Yuval Harari was saying. And to let you know, of course, like I said, that is a Hebrew name. He is a professor of the University of Jerusalem in Israel. So,
but aren't they already doing that right now? I mean, just by them with this event that we have now and people giving up their consent, they already hacked your brain. They already hacked your thoughts. All they got to do is, like you stated in the beginning of your talk, all it takes is for them to bring an event into play, and you'll be willing to go with anything that they ask for. They want to know what your firstborn name is, what where you live. All these different things are already in place, right? So, it to me to hack your brain it seems simpler than that, because all they have to do is just create an event and then say, hey, you have to consent to this, and you will give everything away. So they already know what's going on, right?
Well, that's behavioral prediction, and and that's probably a very easy way, a very simple way of doing things. Is if you can predict how people will behave, then yeah, you know exactly how to move them in the direction you want. But
Well,
I'm
and not
talking
only
about
that,
getting a little more specific, though. I'm talking about personally specific.
and not
And
only that, but they have technology today that they can digitally change things. They can make some place that's never had snow digitally fix it, and it will look like it's had snow, and people won't catch it. They can create evidence against people in a digital form, and if they have access to your mind and they want you to stop doing something, they'll create a crime for you. They'll remove you.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think they've experimented with that many times with physical objects and things. I think regardless of how people think about it, they've done a lot through the Mandela effect. I had friends and relatives even that have said, I remember there being a house right here. I used to drive by it, and I know there was a house right there. And now I go by there, and it's all overgrown with trees, and it looks like nothing's ever been there. But I know for a fact there was something right there at one time. And so I think they play with people's minds a little bit like that. And myself, I've never brought this up. Um, Here about 4 or 5 years ago, I was traveling here in southern Florida, and I was going through an area where there was a lot of open fields and stuff like that. And I don't know if anybody's ever seen, and this might sound kind of woo-woo, but I don't know if people have ever seen the wave, the lunar wave on the moon. There's video you can find on that where it looks like there's just kind of a ripple wave kind of going across the moon. It almost in a way as if, say, two pictures were spliced together on a photo reel, and that's exactly what I saw. I was looking across this field, and I saw, and it wasn't due to wind or anything like that, because it was an effect that went through the sky, through the trees, down into the field, even the road in front of me, and this ripple just kind of went across in front of my eyes, and I was like, "What was that?" I've never seen it before or since, but I mean, when I saw that, I was like, really made me stop and wonder and ponder this reality, or what we think of as reality, a little bit. Anyway,
Brian, were they spraying chemtrails in your area? Were they spraying chemtrails in your area?
I don't remember if they were or not at that time. I know they do it to some degree down here, not a whole lot. Because one of the issues with spraying chemtrails with southern Florida is essentially, as people know, Florida is a peninsula, and we have a lot of wind down here. And so for them to spray stuff high up, they've kind of got to know which way the wind's blowing and kind of be able to judge where stuff might land, and to a degree, it's probably more of a waste to do it here than it would be, say, in the Midwest or somewhere, more open, where they don't care if it carries it off another 300 miles in another direction, because it's going to land. It's still going to land on people. You know what I mean? It's still going to be in the air that people breathe, and so it necessarily wouldn't be as much of a waste. But down here, the targeting effect of it could be a little more difficult.
So Brian, I just want to you kind of shocked me with
Yeah, because I'm in Southern California.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, she just said she's on Southern California.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you kind of shocked me by saying that, because I had a similar experience. I was in the military. I was stationed in Colorado, and I live in Maryland. So I used to drive home, and I was in Kansas, and I had some similar effect to that as well. And I just chalked it up because Kansas is being flat, and you can see for miles. and I had a similar effect that happened. The same thing, and looked like something. Initially, I thought it was like something. The wind was blowing, but when you look, you can't tell whether the wind was blowing or not because it's just nothing but flat land. But the way when it went across from left to right, and it looked really weird. And I was like, well, maybe it's the wind, but I may have experienced something similar to what you were talking about as well.
Oh, that's interesting because that's exactly what this situation was. That ripple went from left to right, like you mentioned. So there's some consistency there anyway. All right. Well, I think these are just things that everybody needs to pay a little attention to. Maybe pay a little closer attention to your surroundings. Yeah, I recommend, and it's always been an important thing to do, but more so today, if ever, is pay very, very close attention to your surroundings. Know who's around you, know what's in front of you, know what's behind you. Because I think we're going to probably be seeing some things occur that people really haven't experienced in that much in the past. And this isn't, necessarily being derived from just a hunch in my mind, but from things I'm hearing people say and talk about. I try not to mention specifics of things much because it kind of puts ideas in your head, and then it's kind of like say a songwriter. The music writers very often don't listen to other people's music. They don't listen to the radio and things like that. And their reason for doing that is because they don't want to accidentally mimic somebody else's music without realizing it, because it's so easy to do. I think of this hysteria going on right now with the Island Boys. And I don't know if people know about it, but you can look up Island Boys online, and it's ridiculous. But their little song was, I'm an island boy, and if you listen to it, I played it for a friend of mine, and he started laughing. I said, "What?" And he got on his phone and he pulled up a song, and he played the song, "I'm a Barbie girl in a Barbie world." And I was like, "Oh my God, they just totally freaking ripped off that song and changed the lyrics." But they're young kids or young boys, you know what I mean? And they probably know that song from when they were, 4, 5, 6 years old. It got stuck in their head. It's got a beat that goes with it, you know what I mean? And they just kind of mimicked it. But that's an example of why, like, musicians don't do it, And so it's the same way, different things will trigger things in your mind. It's like the yellow VW syndrome. You never see one until you own one. Once you own a yellow VW, you start seeing them everywhere. You know what I mean? And it's just weird how our mind works. But anyway, Haya, did you have anything you wanted to bring up while you're here?
You did mention something about statistics, and when I had to take a couple statistics classes in the university, I was really happy to hear that one of my professors, he says, you're looking for the truth. You're never going to find the truth in statistics. I go, what are you talking about? He says, it's whoever is paying for the study.
Exactly.
Whoever is paying for the study, they can tweak something. They can tweak it ever so little, and it's going to go in their favor. So he says statistics is not the truth. If you're looking for the truth, don't look for it in statistics. I was so happy to hear that.
And who sponsors all projects?
Thank you for telling me that.
Who sponsors all projects through contracts or grants? The United States.
Yeah. There's a gentleman I used to know that he had a favorite saying, and his saying was that figures don't lie, but liars figure.
I heard that if you want to get the most accurate statistics, you want to go to a life insurance company or companies.
Yeah, right. Because they don't want their dollar influenced. They want to know exactly what's up.
Mm-hmm.
Their bottom line will rely on those stats. So that would make sense.
Mm.
Well, everybody, we're hitting on an hour here. Thanks for joining us, and jump on board every Sunday night at 9 o'clock. As long as something crazy doesn't come up every now and then, about once a year, I've got maybe something that occurs if I have another obligation or a previous obligation. But other than that, like I always tell everybody, you know, if you're going to study anything, study who you really are, where you're really from, and where you're really at, because you've been deceived on all three of those. Good night, guys.
Good night, everybody.
Mhm. Good night.
Right.